All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Research Capacity Development Unit, the Pyramid Research Evidence Workshop. You are the facilitator today is Prof. Yu, who is an associate professor at the Department of Educational Leadership and Management. She has worked at the Human Sciences Research Council before joining the University of Johannesburg. Her PhD investigated the research and research relationship from the University of Pretoria. Her master's and bachelor's degree were in business management and administration in Norway and China, respectively. She self-claimed to be a multi-potentialite. She's a critical thinker with extensive interdisciplinary knowledge and a wide range of interests. Her publication spans authoring and co-authoring of over 35 books, book chapters, journal articles, reports, and policy briefs, and 10 conference presentations. She publishes widely in interdisciplinary fields, including meta science, knowledge production, research ethics, learning, and communication theories, as well as educational technology and implication for the society, educational policy, cultural studies, bilingual education, higher education studies, and in China. So, just some ground rules. Everyone else, please make sure that your mic is muted. If you'd like to ask a question, please do so in the chat box provided. Um, and well, there she is. Good morning, Prof. I'm just gonna hand over to her, and thank you to all the participants for joining and for booking a space for this workshop. So please do enjoy. Thank you. Over to you, Prof.
Good morning, everyone. Actually, I noticed there's a mistake in the time of on this first slide because originally that was the original plan for the dates, but we moved it a little bit later because that was shortly after the break. Thanks for joining us. And today we are going to talk about research. And I think by the number of interests that we have received, I would assume that there is a lot of interest on research. And I mean, we know that academics are expected to, do research and produce. And as students, I think most of you are probably are. Also, I expect it. I mean, your work, your postgraduate, work is primarily based on research, whichever type. They can be mini dissertations or full dissertations or, different kinds, but they are still research. So I think I will just get started. I think I want to kind of want to have a quick, let's see. I want to do a quick poll in terms of what kind of research, because today we are all going to talk about research. And I want to do a quick poll of what kind of research you have encountered. Actually, by doing that, I want you to do this Menti link. And actually, I will need to then go on to that link myself. So please click on that link and put in some of the words of the kind of research you have encountered. It can be that, I mean, I'm sure many of you have read lots of different kinds of research. You have seen, others, what kind of research, and you might have worked on, you might be working on an article, you might be working on some kind of publications, you might be working on something. So I want to get a sense of how you actually categorize research from your end. And I would go to, I'm going to share the result of the link just now. I probably need to get out of that slides, but just give me a second. I'm going to show that just now. So please go on to that link and put in the words or the kind of research that you have seen. I'm going to share that link just now. Okay. Typical, you guys can see it now, right?
Yes, we can. We can see it.
Okay, great. So I think the way that you categorize now, it's okay. So quantitative, qualitative mixed method. That's kind of one way of looking at it. We generally call that research approach. And empirical, experimental, that's a kind of different way of looking at it. That's interesting. We are going to come back to it. Archives. Okay, so some of you, I assume that's from a historic department. Interview, that's related to qualitative. Participatory, that's kind of also related to more to the qualitative. Again, some of the things are overlapping, we can see, and they might refer to similar or slightly different things. Are there others that are still put in the words? Because maybe when you're doing that, I will explain a little bit of my background in addition to what Deborah said. So I mean, my PhD was quite many years ago. And actually, when I was doing my PhD, my first article when I was doing my PhD, and it actually has nothing to do with my PhD, was in the early days when I, starting to look for the topic and what kind of things that I might be interested. And I was reading a certain topic on policy practice, kind of policy practice gap. And I read some interesting books and all that. And I found that it's kind of, I can see a kind of a model emerging from what I read. And like, I didn't see people writing about it. So I just wrote that model and submitted to a journal. It wasn't like a top journal, but it was accepted. So that was related to some of the kind of research evidence that we are going to talk about. It's one type of research. So I see there are a little bit more the words coming in. Explanatory. Who wrote that? Can you please explain that? I'm not familiar with that word. I think all the other ones I have seen before. So can you unmute yourself and maybe tell us a little bit about eplan? I don't even know how to pronounce that word. Anyone? Can you unmute yourself and tell us a little bit more about what kind of research that is? Okay, I don't hear any response, so I think I will just continue then. So then again, my main field is in education, as you probably have seen from the introduction, but I publish actually quite widely in other fields, in psychology, in sociology, in about identities, and also governance and other things. So in a way, my experience largely draw from kind of more social science part of it. However, I am actually also reading quite a bit into the kind of the medical field broadly, because later on you will notice that quite a lot of what we see actually medical field leads in a lot of different ways. And I also recently I started actually reading philosophical papers, which is quite a different animal, I must admit. So kind of I have generally quite wide encounter of different kinds of research. And I think that would feature into some of the discussions that we are going to have. The very pure science kind of research, I read a few, but not that familiar. But although I kind of generally know kind of what kind of format they follow and all that. So that's kind of the background. Okay, so you have, write about those ones, which doesn't actually feature in these slides, which is interesting. Oh, the other thing I noticed is that this one doesn't allow the animation in terms of showing the content little by little, because I actually want to show you the document types in the Scopus first. But anyway, we'll just talk to it. So I think generally you probably would agree that this is another way of looking at research, what kind of research. And this is the document type that Scopus, which is a database that we actually sometimes use, and we will go back to talk about Scopus a little bit later, It's one of the well-known database together with VOS, that's Web of Science, and a few others. You probably also use Google Scholars. So it's a database that we tend to use when we are searching for research. And this is the document type that is recognized in Scopus. Articles, I mean, we are probably all quite familiar with many of those. Articles, we are generally quite familiar. Books, those are generally like, full-length books. And there will be chapters in the book, and especially for edited versions, there will be different chapters. Conference papers, it's recognized. Although the prestige of conference paper or conference proceedings, sometimes that's almost a different story, but it's also recognized. Usually it's proceedings. Editorial is usually in different volume and editions. The editor sometimes would write a very short piece, kind of summarize or explain what will be in that particular volume. The letters are usually what the audience or we would write to the editors, explaining or asking certain things or discussing certain things, usually very short as well. Notes is also interesting, is generally a kind of discussions or a commentary. Again, it's, we could write to, to the editor or to the journal, to the whatever, having a short discussion on certain things, but this is categorized as notes in Scopus. Reviews, will come back to this. So reviews are generally, I mean, we would probably have all encountered literature review or review of one way or another. Later on, we will come back to the review because there's a lot more stories about the reviews themselves, but it's generally a collection of kind of almost like a scan of the landscape, what has been written on that particular topic. There's also something called short survey, or this is a kind of a mini review that Scopus, just gave a name as a short survey. But it's also a review, it's just a very short survey. But it's also interesting that I think the data paper is another thing that is probably, it's relatively new, although I think many of us probably will be less familiar with this. So this one is about actually talking about the data themselves. And it's kind of discussing about the data, so it's called metadata, and describing a database or a group of data sets and so on and so forth. So I think one of the reasons why I want to show this is that it shows you that actually there are many different kinds of research, that some of them we might not be very clearly aware, or we tend to draw on, when we are reading ourselves or when we are writing ourselves. Some of these ones that we tend to kind of focus on a few that we generally know, but a few others that we probably don't often thought about it. Which we could tap into that if one wishes. And the other thing I want to kind of talk about is that there's another way, very typical way of classify the document type, which is, again, this varies among different disciplines, but generally there will be kind of, I think in social science, generally this is accepted. One will be empirical kind of research that will include what you guys have put into the Menti in terms of a qualitative mixed method, and using observations or using interviews. Those are all data collection methods, but they all go out to the field to collect data. So that's what makes it empirical. Conceptual papers they don't involve field work at all. They don't involve going to collect, we call it kind of primary data. So they generally would kind of have an argument and write about argument. And the example that I mentioned in the beginning of actually my very first paper, which is to kind of looking at what some people have written, and then propose a model to propose a kind of almost like a theoretical model. That's type of the conceptual kind of paper. Oh, by the way, empirical it's a kind of tricky thing there. Sometimes one also analyze secondary data. It's kind of in between these different kinds. But that's also another kind of way of looking at document, which we aren't going to talk too much today. But we will talk about empirical, we'll talk about conceptual, and more importantly, we'll talk about review. So again, just to recap, review is kind of one would collect or provide an overview of the field and to provide some kind of analysis. And often review itself is actually, when published as a review, So in some sense, and we are going to talk about it, once literature review can be published, actually lots of people do that as a review as one piece alone, without any empirical data speaking to it. So reviews generally make a review publishable is that you would then, sometimes one also propose a new theory out of the review, or sometimes after you scan through or you analyze the current status, you will make some suggestions of where the field should be. The other thing, we will talk about review more later on, but review is a very interesting categories. If you have any questions, I am watching the chat, so you can just put in the chat and I would respond to it. Okay, or otherwise, I think Typical can also help me to, if there are questions, because I really like this to be a dialogue. If you like that, because I mean, we academics, we do talk, but it's also nice to have interaction. So especially if you have certain things that you don't agree, don't understand, you want me to clarify, you might want me to explain a little bit further, by all means to interrupt me. I mean, I'm actually, I like that, because to me that's engagement that actually help us to get a sense of whether you are on the same same, you are there, or you understand it, or whatever. Because otherwise, if everyone is quiet, then sometimes it's hard to know what's happening. Okay. I mean, you can, I don't know whether you can just unmute yourself or, ask questions, or otherwise you can raise the hand. Yeah, either way would work. Okay, so let's then look at the pyramid, because this is in a way in the title of this workshop. So this is in a way another way to look at research. And this is interesting. I mean, if you Google evidence hierarchy, you would find, this kind of pyramid. There are slightly difference in how they put into the, different tiers, but broad kind of the broad categories would still apply. So at the bottom is kind of the almost kind of non-empirical or it's called promising, but not necessarily well supported. And I think in the academia, we kind of tend to not, pay too much attention to it. Although it's also tricky, I think now the established academics are also encouraged to actually write op-ed and so on and so forth. But these are the things that it's almost like opinion pieces, or it's expressing people's opinion. It can be from experts, other people also write about it, or its background. So it doesn't kind of have much of it doesn't support it by the actual data. And then the next big tier, which you can see in the middle, the blue ones, are generally the ones that would involve some kind of data collections. So they can be from case, they can be cohort control, they can be cohort. So these are again different kinds, but again you can see the hierarchy I'm going to explain just now. And they can be the RCT, which the randomized controlled trials, which are very prominent, especially in the medical field, but increasingly in social science. We also talk about also not only in in education or social science, but even in economics and other fields, talk about this as the golden kind of method to do an experiment. And then, interestingly, you will see that the well-supported here, the one on the top, is actually related to reviews. Reviews and meta-analysis is also related to synthesis. So it's about you synthesize a number of studies and to write out an article or whatever itself. So it includes different kinds of reviews and synthesis. So broadly, what this pyramid showing is that, firstly, the one with data, supported by data, is better than just the opinions. And I think that's also something that we tend to, you probably have heard in your classes that, I mean, the thing is everyone can have opinions, but how is your opinion being supported by data? So have a good support of data is important when you are making an argument. And among the kind of the data supported, so lots of that is based on the one in the middle is the one based on kind of a single study. So all of them can be single studies that, you know, you either have an experiment or you go collect data. I mean, it can be mixed method. You can go to multiple places, but still in a way, it's one single study. And you know, you can draw data out of that and you can write about that. So that's accepted, but that's kind of in the middle of the pyramid. And the higher one is when you draw in different studies. That's what synthesis is about. That's what reviews is about, is that you will actually draw on multiple studies. Usually it's not done by you. So this is usually secondary kind of studies. Usually you are just kind of really analyze, you know, people's single studies, and you draw a conclusion from multiple studies. So that's broadly what the pyramid is about. And here I also give you the link if you want to read a little bit kind of more about the pyramid, or you can just, like I said, you can just actually Google evidence hierarchy or evidence pyramid. You will see that in Google there are different representations of how the pyramid look like, but there are lots on Google. So now my question, again, I'm going to give you a small exercise, and I don't have a link to that to do that. So actually I want you to participate in this. So I gave you that list of the articles and the books and short surveys and so forth. There's also the data paper, in a way, doesn't really sit in here. But this is the list that I will just quickly show you. This is the list that is the document type that is recognized in Scopus. Okay, so now what I want you to do is to pair all these different types into this pyramid. So I would give you an example. So do you think articles can fit into where in the pyramid? Sometimes this question might become a bit tricky, and I want you to think through all these ones that we've outlined here. So anyone want to take a first try? Articles. How would article fit into this pyramid? Or is it a straightforward case? Anyone? Okay, so Terry is saying that article will go to the top. So you are saying that articles generally will be about reviews. Is that what you mean? Danielle, it depends on the type of study. So articles can actually have different, I mean, you might have encountered. It can have different kinds. They are articles that are reviews. They are articles reporting single studies. They are actually those ones, we probably don't call them articles, but they are op-ed, which probably would be sitting in the bottom, right? Okay, so that's the first one. Okay, Terry, don't worry. So let's then look at the books. So typically, where do you think the books would stand in this pyramid? Again, anyone? Oh, Daniela, do you want to try? I think others are a little bit shy, eh? Or this is too early in the morning. Okay, so books can be about reviews, although it doesn't often. Books can be also case report or kind of reporting the single studies, right? Actually, they are, again, yeah, they depend on kind of books as well. We have seen books, actually, they report a single study. I mean, again, here there are different kinds of single studies, but let's just put them in the broad category of a single study. So they are books published just out of one single studies. I'm not sure whether that will be a surprise for you, but that's actually, we have seen that. More often, books tend to be more about a little bit more information, not necessarily reviews. But generally they are, especially if it's edited, then they probably will be, kind of different informations. And yes, it will depend on whether it's a textbook. Textbook is kind of a different animals here. Generally, we are thinking about the research books here. And Terry, you're also saying that books can also be biographical. Yes, autobiographical. So again, depending on the books. So here we are talking about the research books, but even research books can be, I mean, it can be one case study of, let's say, one person. You know, we have seen that. I mean, when we are, if we are using a case study as a methodology, then we could actually, that person's story would become, you know, that's all your study is about, and you can publish as a book. So that could be, you know, a book, and that will be kind of sitting in the middle. So it's a single study, right? It can kind of, the books probably wouldn't be really just opinions. Although actually recently I read a book, it's people writing about their stories, which isn't really backed up by almost any kind of evidence. So it can be, I suppose, at the more kind of opinion type, but it's generally more rare depending on, you know, the type of the books. Yes. I suppose that would also apply to the chapters and the conference papers, right? Editorials. What do you think editorials generally would fit? This one also becomes a bit tricky. Or we can even talk about that together, maybe with letters. And again, did I give definitions here? I mean, I did talk about it when we are in the previous slides. Yes, the editorial here refer to the journal editorial according to the Scopus definitions. It can be a little bit about the review, you're right. It can be a review of the articles that will be included in that particular kind of volume or editions. Although generally, again, we kind of tend to not looking at editorial as a review, kind of the common sense of the reviews. It's a kind of interesting combination between reviews and kind of a little bit of expert opinions. Okay. So some, yeah, Ethel is saying that it's kind of, it could be expert opinions. So but it sometimes also do include a little bit a review of the articles in that particular. So it's not a review of all the articles or a broad overview of the landscape, but it's the review of that, you know, what's included in that particular edition. So it's kind of, it can be a combination of that. The letters. So letters, we explained earlier, is usually what the, you know, the research community or the people who's reading that particular journal or whatever write to the editors and then being published. So what a letter usually would sit? So letters tend to be more about opinions, whether they are expert or not, you know, tend to be more about opinions, although of course, I mean, that doesn't exclude that person to include some of, let's say the person has conducted some studies or whatever, they use that as, you know, a kind of a evidence or to support their argument. Although that generally doesn't, again, we generally wouldn't categorize as the one kind of this type in the middle. Yeah, so it's tend to be more like opinion, although it can include a little bit in the middle, but usually we wouldn't categorize it as one of those single studies. The notes. So notes are generally discussions or commentaries by the, you know, by the readers. What would notes fit into? Okay, so notes sounds more like opinions, right? Okay, good. And I think notes is good. So notes generally we would you know, be more comfortable to put that into. So the other thing now you are more you're kind of more conscious of is that, you know, we will see all those different types in, you know, say in Scopus or in broadly in different databases, but they again, when we are writing our own literature review or when we are writing our own articles or whatever, kind of it's also good to be aware of what kind they are, and if we are, you know, quoting it, whether it's actually we are quoting an expert opinion or we are quoting a single study or whether we are quoting a review. Again, we will come back to all that a little bit later, but I think the idea here is really for us to be a little bit more aware Firstly, there are more different kinds than we normally aware of. Two is that they do come at a different kind of, different hierarchy in a way. So we will come back to the review a little bit later. The short survey is a type of review, so that would be covered in the review. Okay, so I want you to pair another one. So in the earlier slide, I also talk about this other way of classifying the research, which is empirical, conceptual, and reviews. Okay, so again, review here we are clearly have it here. Empirical, where does empirical corresponding to in this pyramid? Okay, Pamela, would you be able to explain a little bit what do you mean by conceptual being more like case report? And also, what do you understand as case report?
Good afternoon, good morning. Can you hear me? Okay, so what I understand with the case report is basically closely related to a case study because you are focusing on a particular case that you are working on, and it's usually in the field. So I would associate it with an empirical research because you go into the field to collect data, and yeah, I think that's what I think.
Okay, so I think you are, if I listen closely to what you said, actually you used the word of empirical again. So the case report, that's generally, I mean, what I kind of trying to summarize is that the one in the middle, they tend to be kind of more single studies, or there are very small amount of single studies that one generally go out and collect data themselves. So case report is generally part of that empirical kind of studies. Okay, so what I'm asking is the conceptual. So empirical, that will include again, if I think back of what you put in the Menti, those mixed method, quantitative, qualitative, all those. So it's all about that you would need to go out and collect data, basically. So you need to, the person who's writing it would be, collecting data. There will be a primary data collections one way or another. Okay, so yeah, so empirical means that you will collect data. So then let's see. So Pretorius, when you say the top of the pyramid, you are talking about which one is the top of the pyramid? Pretorius?
I'm going to just unmute myself. It's easier.
Yes.
When you said empirical data, I think it's more the middle of the pyramid, really. I typed that in later.
Yeah, I see that now.
Yes, I think rather the middle of the period, because when you go out and you collect your data, depending on how it's collected as well. But yeah, maybe rather the middle than the top.
Okay. So, and I see there are a few other chats here that the RCT and in the cohort case and all that, they are, because they all go out and collect data. So they are, in a way, they are all empirical. Okay. And again, of course, you can have multiple sites, you can have single sites, and that's almost the hierarchy within this middle tier, which we will come back to. So within this middle tier, within this empirical, there are also hierarchies to some extent, but they are all kind of, we can all broadly classify them as empirical. Where does conceptual sits? Conceptual is a kind of interesting case here. So again, come back to, I mean, what is a conceptual paper? So conceptual paper generally just make an argument. It might have some empirical data, but it's not reporting, definitely not reporting on a single study's empirical data. Usually it's about making an argument, proposing a theory, proposing a model, that kind of things. So in a way, it's also, the other thing I think you guys are starting to see it is that sometimes it's actually tricky. So although the pyramid seems to be very straightforward, but sometimes it's not. So on one hand, it seems to be almost like opinions, right? They are kind of, it's in that person's opinion, they propose this. But again, that proposing of the, that kind of opinion needs to be grounded in lots of literature, needs to be grounded in different things. So generally, actually, we don't treat conceptual paper as just expert opinions, which is actually quite low on the pyramid. Generally, we would, it doesn't need to have really a clear synthesis of the literature or whatever, but generally, actually, we see conceptual papers quite highly in this pyramid. I mean, again, in a way, it's not clearly written out in this pyramid, but it's actually quite being seen as having high prestige. So it's actually in the top of the pyramid generally. Yes, Danielle, you want to tell us a little bit more about using this can't even pronounce the word, unobstructive method. I know that you mentioned that before. So tell us a bit more so we can all learn.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. So unobtrusive methods are when you use secondary data and different literature sources and documentary sources. However, it's not your typical grey literature, so it would include authoritative literature and documents. For instance, in my discipline in public management and governance, we do content analysis, conceptual analysis, comparative analysis of policy documents, for instance. And that is secondary data, really, although it's a document. So with unobtrusive methods, you don't go and collect primary data. You can make use of secondary data and literature sources, but there's no interaction with any respondents or participants in a study, hence the word unobtrusive. And unobtrusive methods include documentary analysis, comparative analysis, conceptual analysis, comparative analysis. I think I'm repeating myself.
Yeah, you mentioned.
And yeah, so those are different techniques of analyzing these types of documents.
And actually, even adding to that, Danielle, thanks for the explanation. I think one thing that actually we have seen, especially with COVID, is that this method is really become a lot more popular during COVID because, I mean, we can't go out and collect data. And people being really creative, and before COVID, people being experimenting on all those things. But I think during COVID, people were really using more of that, just doing document analysis, doing secondary data analysis. Sometimes it's also, there are other kind of ways. Ethel, I would just let you speak just now. There are also other types. I think it's also probably included in the anyway, which is to ask the participant to collect data themselves. I mean, you can ask them to voice record, you can ask them to write in the diary. I mean, those things are all experimented before, but I think it really, because of the COVID, because of the, we don't want to go out and, physically, having physical contact. So that the whole domain of that is really, giving a quite big boost, which is interesting to note as well. Ethel?
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I have a question for Danielle. You say like this type of data includes document analysis, content analysis, and what would be the purpose, like the objective? Is it to build a concept, to identify a concept, or to support like your ideas generally? What would I use this type of methods for?
Well, it could be anything. It can be compared to a type of literature review. So you do get different conceptual papers. So it depends on the aim of your conceptual paper. So unobtrusive methods are mostly used when doing a literature review or a conceptual paper. It's commonly used in a conceptual paper.
Okay, thank you.
So in a way, this this is to contrast the empirical kind of data collection or the empirical kind of research, which one would need to go and basically have some interaction with the participant, even with the quantitative, survey, whatever, or experiment, whatever. You are still going to, meet them. I mean, these days you can do online, whatever, but you are still going to have some content. So this unobstructed, my English. It's really that you don't need to basically have any interaction with the participant or with those people. Then you're right. Okay. So review. Sorry.
Did you ask a question?
Now I was just asking whether that's more or less correct. So this is basically kind of in contrast to the empirical, which one would have interactions with the participant, with the with the people.
And what you could also commonly do, you may have a study where you are collecting data, but just for your literature review section, you decide to do a documentary analysis. That's also acceptable, but it could be used as a data analysis method in its own.
And I think, again, the other thing that Danielle, you have mentioned is that this quite much depends on the field. I mean, in certain field, it's more expected or more accepted than the others. I will give the example of philosophies. I mean, they hardly. Actually, I was talking to the people in the philosophy department a short while ago. Currently, they have one project that going out to collect data, but it's like so rare that it's almost the first time they ever do that. So generally, they just write conceptual papers. They just make an argument. They would write, they analyze certain things and come to a conclusion. So some fields would have certain type more. And for example, again, in education, generally people are expected to do field work, to do empirical studies more, although other types are, all accepted, but especially as a postgraduate student, then in education, broadly, one is expected to do empirical generally. Although I think secondary data analysis currently is also kind of accepted, but it's not that common. So depending on the field, and I think in Danielle's field, which is governance and sometimes policy, analysis of the policy documents. I mean, those are a typical type of the things that one would do. So that will be not empirical at all. So reviews, again, we will come back to it. Again, I want you to think about op-ed. So in a way, we have mentioned to it. So op-ed, where do you think would fit in here? Okay, so Danielle would be giving some links to a good reference to that that method. So back to my question. So op-ed, where do you think op-ed would fit into this pyramid? You guys are all quiet now. So firstly, have you all read op-ed before? Can you think of an example of an op-ed that you have read or you've written or you've encountered before? Expert opinion. So those are generally, interestingly, only the people who are quite good in the field or being quite well recognized in the field write op-ed. I mean, the people are just new to the field generally don't write that, and even if they write, other people won't read it. It's generally written by the expert, but they are generally just opinions. They are generally not or the expectation is that they don't have to be supported by data, although sometimes they do, but it's not like a reporting of a single study or reporting of a review or one way or another. Okay, so Daniel, thanks for the link. So anyone who's more interested in the unobtrusive method, you can read that link. Preprint, have you guys heard of preprint? So preprint, again, in certain field, it has become more popular in the past decades or so. It's where people would publish, but they are not peer reviewed. So there will be different kind of platforms or different places one can print. And even some journals actually, that's a whole different story. Let's not get there. But they are generally not peer reviewed. Generally, their articles. Sometimes it can also be conference proceedings one way or another. They are published, but they are not peer reviewed. So where do you think that might fit? And also certain fields accept, different, accept preprint differently. So some fields are very well, accepting that, especially in the IT, the information science and stuff. So in other fields, I think in social science, generally the acceptance is a lot lower. And there's also people sometimes talk about the question of self-plagiarism, whatever, when a preprint goes into a formal print. So there's another kind of debate about that. But where do you think preprint would fit into this paradigm? But not paradigm, pyramid. Anyone? Okay, you're starting to become quiet, or it's just the speed of the connection is an issue. Again, preprint can be reporting a study, a single study. Some preprint actually is a review. I've seen that too. A few of them actually are completely just opinions. So in a way, again, we have seen that is that, almost all these things can fit into the different tiers of the pyramid. And the other thing is also, if you notice on this particular graph or the picture, it talks about the quality on the left-hand side. And what it's trying to say is that as one go up the pyramid, the quality generally increase. But here we also need to be mindful that here the quality can be looked at across the different, hierarchy, which is that generally the perceived quality of, say, the opinions, which isn't necessarily based on things, are generally conceived to be lower than, having kind of data supporting a certain thing, which is the one in the middle. Or interestingly, reviews and synthesis are generally seen as having a higher qualities, or maybe quality isn't exactly the correct word, but it will be seen as a higher prestige. And also that relate to kind of being cited more generally. But the other thing is also within tiers, I mean, we mentioned that a little bit earlier, is that even within tiers sometimes is, the issue of which one is more prestige or which one is regarded having higher quality. And of course, here we aren't even talking about the quality of, let's say, data collection or quality of writing, or let's say among systematic reviews, there are good ones and there are not so good ones. So we aren't even talking about that quality, but let's even looking at, I think within the empiricals, here generally, if one is doing experiment, the RCT is accepted as kind of almost the best method. Otherwise, if you can't do RCT, then you need to do some kind of control, or you need to kind of have some quasi, but it's seen as less as good as the RCT. But also interestingly, cohort is generally better than the kind of the single studies, because cohort you follow the participant for a period of time, and then for that you can see kind of trend, and you can do some other kind of analysis that is not possible to for those kind of cross set or the kind of a snapshot of cross section kind of survey or analysis. So cohort is generally actually seen as having a higher value or higher quality than the kind of single study that we tend to do. Okay. So this is in a way what we are talking about in terms of the empirical studies. They can include all those, different method, qualitative, quantitative, many of that you are familiar with or you have heard of. And we can also talk about a method in terms of, whether it's just observational or whether it's experimenting or whether it's cross-section or the time series that relate to the whole cohort things, or what kind of data collection method we are using. Interestingly, even within these different methods, there's often a perceived kind of, some are better than the others, or the quality rendered or coming out of that kind of study is better than the others. For example, generally people would, accept that experiment is better than just purely observational, or the conclusion one can draw out of experiment is generally more robust than the ones that can be, detected from the observational kind of data. And time series is generally seen as better than the cross-section kind of a snapshot. And between observation and interview is a tricky kind of stories, but we kind of generally are aware that interviews alone is rely on the self-reporting, and it has its own disadvantages. Observations also has its own disadvantages, but then observations, you see people's behavior, which actually tend to show more of what the persons really think is important, or because what people do is not always the same as what they will say. So then there's a little bit of the hierarchy between that two. And of course, when we talk about the quality or the empirical studies, the other thing we generally would think is also the sampling. Again, bigger samples generally is better than the very small samples, although I mean we have seen single case studies, but generally also it in certain fields, like let's say the policy policymakers or whatever, they generally want to see more a kind of a number. Numbers tell the story, or the number would have a bit heavier weight in how they would take the research evidence. Conceptual papers, I think we actually have seen some examples so far, but generally the argument is quite essential in conceptual papers. And I kind of trying to think of another paper that, and the other thing is also, don't be shying away from writing conceptual papers or reviews, even when you are doing your studies. I mean, most of you are postgraduate students. You can actually do that when you are doing your study or in your earlier careers. I mean, that's completely normal. Because I'm kind of thinking back of some of the early paper that I wrote. I mean, they are actually conceptual papers. And another paper I wrote was on, that time I was looking at assessment and the whole debate between formative and summative. And so I made a paper in that particular article to say that although the formative assessment seems to be kind of almost intuitively appealing, but it has a few drawbacks that if the people who are really promoting that isn't paying sufficient kind of attention to that, actually that whole thing isn't going much further. So as long as you can make an argument, you can make a good conceptual paper. And I have also mentioned that conceptual paper, another very typical conceptual paper, is to propose a certain kind of a theoretical framework. Again, give you an example of something that we are doing now, is that one of the projects we are looking at now is looking at kind of almost readiness for technology. And firstly, we've seen that there are lots of people propose lots of different models in terms of readiness, how to understand readiness. But one thing that we have noticed that is not much talked about is the kind of multi-level view of readiness, because what we are going to propose is that actually thinking about readiness, one need to think about multi-level. Multi-level, we mean that you can think of readiness in terms of a person. I mean, thinking about IT generally, a person can be ready, but if, let's say, a person can be, pushing for it, but they might not have followers. They might feel frustrated if they are the only person who's pushing for that, but nobody is standing with them. I can think of a colleague in our department who always feel that, she's really good at thinking of new ideas, but she's ready for that, but other people in the department aren't. So they can be on an individual level, they can be on a team level, on a project level. But even with lots of successful projects, it might not necessarily fly in, say, a department or in a faculty or in institutions, because at that kind of level, certain other things need to happen for the readiness from the lower level to actually scale up. And then even when, you know, institutions are doing well, or they, you know, they incorporate ICT, or they you know, doing all this and that, it doesn't mean that nationally it's going to take off. So what we are proposing is that, you know, actually looking at readiness, one need to actually be very clearly aware, and one need to be deliberately aware of those multi-level, together with the readiness, you know, those construct itself. So one could propose a theoretical framework. And that's also some, you know, you could consider when you are finishing your PhD or master's or whatever. Sometimes after you have collected your data, you might find that you can propose, or you can, you know, you can propose a change or adjustment on the existing theoretical framework, and you can write about that, and that you know, becomes a conceptual paper. So that's, I mean, again, if you are interested, think about all those possibilities that what you can actually write. And also, I think it's also about be more aware when you are reading next time what kind it might, you know, what kind of research it actually might be. So lots of the, you know, the rest of the discussions are really on the reviews, because reviews are a very interesting kind of animal. Firstly, it's, we generally know that, you know, the knowledge is, you know, there are more and more knowledge and explosion and all that. Actually, nobody can really digest all the publications. I mean, I don't have the figure with me, talking about how much of the papers are published every day. I mean, for a doctor, for whoever in which field, I mean, any field, one just, it's impossible to actually read all the new publications. And so review, in a way, standing into this, say that, you know, because reviews is about synthesis of the existing literature or whatever that has been published. So it will reduce the amount of that. So, you know, a review would say review 100 or 1,000 papers, so that by reading that one review itself, you will actually get an understanding, or you will get a broad overview of that field, which is great for us, you know, people who's reading. And that's also one of the reasons why reviews and synthesis generally draw more citations, because that, I mean, people tend to, firstly, it helps them when they are digesting the field, when they are getting an understanding of the field, but also it's kind of, you know, you will go back to say that because I read this review, and therefore, you know, I'm building on that review, or my study is, in a way, that's what we do with the literature review, is that my study is building on the review of the literature, so that I'm filling in the gap. And the other thing interesting about review is that, especially with, if one does a kind of more quantitative reviews, which we will come back to a little bit later, is that it has a greater analysis power, because it draws on the various, you know, the primary studies. We generally call them that way. And it also would have a greater statistical power, because usually one of the things, especially in education, I think, is there tend to be lots of small studies. And one thing with small studies, you know, especially if one is doing it quantitatively, is that if your sample size is relatively small, you would, by the, you know, by the nature of that kind of small sample, you will see more variations, and you will be less likely be going to get any kind of, you know, p-values that's significant enough, or, you know, having the power. So by combining the different studies, by, you know, synthesize different studies, actually you would automatically be having a higher power. Higher power meaning that you will be more likely to be able to have significant p-values. And of course, when we are, you know, doing the reviews, we also reduce the problem of a single study, or kind of representing the representation of one single studies, because then we almost like balance out of the, you know, if there are flaws, if there are errors, if there are issues, if there are context kind of, you know, variations, we generally have a more balanced view, because we are, you know, pulling from different studies. And generally it provides a better kind of insight, because the, you know, again, in qualitative studies or in education, we often talk about generalized, you know, ability, or you know, if the sample is small, if the study is small, then, you know, we often say that that's one of the big limitations of my study, and other people should really, you know, the findings should look at the findings, or if you want to think whether the findings will be, you know, applicable to the other context. One should do that with cautions. But with reviews, because it's a synthesis, then, you know, the kind of the findings will be more robust. And that's also one of the reasons why it's sitting at a higher level in that pyramid. And though reviews are not without its potential problems. So one of the things that we typically see, it's both of its advantage and disadvantage, is that the effects from, you know, we are mainly thinking about experiment here, is that when you synthesize certain things, the effects tend to be averaged out. I mean, so on one hand, it tend to be more balanced, but on the other hand, it tends to be more averaged out. So if you look at the graphs on the right hand side, you see the single studies, these are all about effect size. They are kind of more, you know, more wide range in a way. But if you synthesize, you look at the last line on this first the top graph, so it's kind of sitting in the middle of that. And it's kind of, it's really, it's a lot smaller. And if you look at the bottom, this graph, this is the diamond that's very typically seen in meta-analysis. We will come back to this just now. It tends to be a lot smaller than any of those single studies. And the effect tend to be more in the middle, but also, you know, see in the 1 or in the 0, which means there's no or there's little effect. Because when you pull more studies, you know, the ones with bigger effect would balance out with the one with the negative effect, with a smaller effect. So the overall effect will be smaller. So that's the general observations. So the review tend to find the effect not as big or impressive as the single studies. Okay. And the other thing that we typically see is that the review, sometimes the readability is really not very good, because ultimately it's like you come up to say the finding will be that, you know, this thing is very complicated and it depends on the context, and you need to take all this into consideration. It's almost kind of bring in the single studies kind of context back into the review itself. So usually there will be, if you don't have the nuances, then you interpret things too easily, too broad stroke, which isn't really helping. But if there are too many nuances, then it's not very easy to read. Again, I mean, if you guys are interested, you can afterwards, or if you have already, sometimes read some of those systematic reviews report or whatever. Sometimes it's not very easy to interpret or to read because they tend to be long, they tend to be very complicated. The other thing I think we should all be aware of is that garbage in, garbage out. So if you are, you know, that refers to the primary studies that's included in the review or in the synthesis. So if you don't do a good quality control of the primary studies that you include, that applies to our literature review as well. And that's actually one of the problems, that when we are doing literature review, we don't always screen the quality of those things that we include very closely. But the thing is really, if you include the garbage, and then, I mean, your result will be very biased. So whatever your pooled or whatever your final, you know, in this case, you know, the effect set is, depending what kind of primary studies you include. So be careful of what is included. And generally, we'll touch upon that later, is that generally when people do, you know, reviews, they would have some kind of a screen, although that's not always done very rigorously. And of course, there might be, you know, sampling issues. There are publication biases. Again, when we talk about systematic review, we will come back to this, is that if we only source what is published, then there will be a bias embedded into whatever is there, because journals or whatever things tend to publish things that have a significant result, or tend to have something that have a positive result instead of the negative, or instead of they find nothing. If people find nothing, let's think of an example of an experiment. If they don't find that experiment being, you know, finding any effect, if they write about it, they might not be published. But that's actually, in a way, it's an important thing to know, that that thing might not have an impact. So whatever that's being published might have a kind of more positive bias towards whatever that reported. The other thing with the reviews of synthesis is that also because generally one need to take some time to do a good review, and it's very soon out of the date, and updating the review actually has been a mission of some of the kind of we will also seeing them systematic review database and all that. People starting to be more aware of that, because you can do a review this year, and maybe, you know, during this year lots of other single studies come out, and then next year if you don't update it, then your result will be, you know, out of date. And the other thing we will also touch upon briefly a little bit later is about the homogeneity among those primary studies. Again, this is the issue that actually is a big issue among the reviews. Is that this is especially for the meta-analysis, when you want to pull in the effective size, is that if there isn't sufficient similarity between the primary studies, then actually it doesn't make sense to synthesize them. Then you would rather do a more qualitative synthesis, or you kind of would describe those, you know, a little bit, or put them into categories, or there are other ways to address it. We will cover just a little bit, but it will make a lot less sense actually trying to pull the result into a number, or trying to kind of, you know, so it's broadly about being mindful of the homogeneity in the studies. And there are different ways, and there are different kinds of homogeneity, and there are different kinds of ways to address that. But just be mindful of that, and we will come back to that a little bit later. And the other thing, this also applies to the effect size specifically, is about how small is large enough. So, you know, when people do a meta-analysis, they will come up with a figure, you know, average effect size, or, you know, the pooled effect size. And, you know, they tend to see the number of, you know, 0.2, 0.5 is very, very rare. 0.1, sometimes it's even less than that. So how small is large enough for it actually to have a meaning? So again, different fields or different kind of experiment or different kind of things would differ. So what I include here is the kind of almost a recommend. It's a kind of generic recommendations, but it does need to be taken into consideration of the specific field. But generally, if you see 0.2, there might be something there. But again, you need to kind of compare with the kind of almost the benchmark, or, you know, what's generally happening in the field. If you get 0.3 upwards, you probably are really having something there. But if it's less than that, it's probably not very good effect. Okay. So again, like I said, the rest of the slides are actually going to be about reviews, because a review is a very, very interesting type. And again, I will encourage you to do actually reviews. We have seen we have actually a colleague in Thailand. He's really training his PhD student. I think some of you probably have been to his workshops, Prof. Hellinger. He's really training his PhD student to write out their literature review as a review and to be published. And he typically start with bibliometric review, which is, I mean, we are going to touch upon a little bit here. So bibliometric review is an interesting thing, which the advantage of that is to give one a very broad overview of what's happening in the field. And that's generally a very good thing to do when you are almost like new to the field and you want to get a very quick kind of overview of what's happening in the field. So what it does is that it uses some of those, it looks at certain things, but it doesn't actually do a review of each individual article. So you aren't going to read those individual documents. What it does is that you actually generally would, not the maximum, they would draw in the abstract, they would draw in the, you know, the authors, the affiliation, and so on and so forth, do some kind of analysis, but it will show you something interesting. So this is a very typical kind of thing what you can do with a bibliometric review. So it would show you publication related metrics. Science mapping, again, that's something that has been becoming popular in the recent years, and Hellinger does a lot of that. But there are also other kinds of analysis, bibliometric analysis. So here we'll focus on the kind of the quite popular ones that does a lot. So total publications, how much publication has been there for this particular field? Who's contributing to it? Are they generally writing it solo also, or they tend to write co-authored? And one can even draw out kind of maps of who is co-authoring with who, which also showing you some kind of cluster in that particular field. And since when the publication we have seen, because certain fields start not from since forever, and you can also see that from a certain year, maybe the publication kind of just shoot off. So that also tells you something. Productivity, that can be per year or per author or per journal or per whatever. The other very typically done thing is about citations. So citation can be total citation of the field, or a certain article, a certain author, or a certain journal. It can be average citations. And even if you see in the science mapping, you will see citation analysis is a very typical tool in the bibliometric analysis. So it can show you, what is the most influential publication in that domain by citation. But the other thing is also co-citation. Co-citation is interesting. I think I have a slide in the next one, is it? Yeah. So there's this thing about co-citation, and this is biblio coupling. The difference between that is that if you read this, I think this is a very good representation of the difference between these kind of things. So if these two papers, P1 and P2, they are pointing to P3, they both cite P3, so the P1 and P2 will be bibliographically coupled. And then if P3 is quoted by P4 and P5, P4 and P5 will be co-cited. So P4 and P5 will be co-citing P3. And the interesting with co-citation is that co-citation tend to pick up the actual most influential paper in that particular field better than citations, because citations will be depending on the database you are drawing. So it's, let's say I have 100 in that database, so it's among the 100 that will be the most cited paper. But co-citations often take the most cited paper outside that 100. It will actually show you what is the paper that is mostly being co-cited by my 100 in the database. So it tends to be showing more accurately what is the actual and most influential paper in that field. I mean, I've been playing along with this concept in different kind of, and it's a very interesting kind of that kind of analysis to show what, because one of the things I did was, Danielle, we generally don't do this in Atlas TI. I mean, I've never done that in Atlas TI. We do this, I use a tool combining Scopus and VOS Viewer, which is also what Hellinger does, although kind of the second part, the VOS Viewer, can be replaced by the other, kind of, we call it science mapping tools. They are visualization tools. But also the database, I use Scopus primarily. Other people also use Web of Science, VOS, or others. They have their advantage and disadvantage. But the combination of Scopus and VOS Viewer is a good starting point to do this kind of analysis. And again, Hellinger has workshops from the postgraduates, talking about that. So yeah, just look for the recordings. So the coupling I've mentioned, the co-words analysis is also an interesting one. So this one we typically draw on, so it's about the keywords that the articles would list, or generally it's by the authors. But the co-words analysis would show you a map like that, although these are actually a map of people, but co-words, we call it the keywords co-occurrence, would also show something similar to this. It would show you how those words relate to one another. But also one of the feature in VOS Viewer, which is interesting, is it's going to show you the temporal evolution of those keywords. In other words, it will show you by this time and that time how the keywords used by people in this field or in that database that you have has evolved. Are there new keywords people tend to use more than the others than the previous time? So that's a very interesting kind of concept to look at how the field is evolving. Co-authorship, that's if in that particular field, again, certain fields, they have more co-author than the other. Certain field, people just don't co-author. But if you see that in that particular field, that people tend to co-author, you can draw a map to show that, you know, how they are co-authoring. I think I'm not going to talk about that. I'm also watching the time. So this is actually examples of potential kind of, I can't remember this is co-author or this is citations. But these are the maps drawn out from Scopus. It's not by me. I'm just, you know, cutting from certain publications from others. So what you can see interesting is the colors. I think that's probably the first thing that you will notice. And so the colors representing the cluster in VOS viewers. And these two figures also showing you the difference between the bibliographic coupling and the co-citations. It's actually from the same database. They done the two analysis, and this is the figure they draw. So one thing you can see is that it actually looks quite differently. And we tend to use co-citation a lot more because people say that co-citation, they evolve. So the bibliographic coupling, if you have that database, your map is always going to stay like that. The co-citations, when people cite it more, other people cite it more, whatever, it actually would evolve. So it would show a kind of change over time. So the other thing is also by co-citation, actually, we identify the cluster of that particular field. So this group of people, not because they co-write, but their writing have some similarities. And then it's at some point you will need to interpret why this color is different from that color. I mean, VOS Viewer has its own algorithm to determine that, because of, you know, how one is citing the others and so on and so forth. So, but it's interesting to use those kind of information to help you to figure out what's happening in that field. That's very, very useful when actually one does literature review. So actually now I also ask my PhD student to do that as a kind of the first step into your literature review. And bibliometric review also tend to produce this kind of figures. So you will, this is document per year. So you will see that how it has been fluctuating or how it started. You will see the network, you know, again, this is similar to the one we have just seen, different colors and how people group, group among themselves. And you probably will see tables. This is a table about the top journals by citation and by citation impact. So here you can identify which journals publish more in this field and by what kind of index that you probably should read that kind of journal or pay a little bit attention to that journal. And you can also see the heat map of, you know, who is. So here, if you see it's more red, that person has a more impact in that particular group. And you kind of, the green ones are the one more on the outside. So you can have all those visual representation of what's happening in that field. And so this is what we have said is all about bibliometric review. So there's another type of review which is more thematic and which is more similar to what we generally do as a literature review. I mean, we tend to, you know, review the literature. We tend to come up with themes and then we write about them. So, you know, literature, they tend to have this, you know, broad themes. And again, this is just examples, but we tend to have, you know, this kind of groups, and we tend to write it almost like, I mean, but then this is very typical of, you know, how we write thematic reviews. And sometimes people also combine the bibliometric review and the thematic reviews, or doing the bibliometric review first, so give a broad overview. Because the bibliometric review, you don't need to actually read the articles. Maximally, you only need to read the abstract, and often you don't even need to read the abstract. But the thematic review, you need to go really into reading each individual, you know, abstract and, you know, the article itself, and you're trying to come up with how they relate to one another and so on and so forth. Okay, so I'm going to talk about systematic reviews. So again, we all have done literature reviews, And we all know what literature review is about, but literature review is not exactly the same as systematic reviews. So one of the big difference of systematic review is that it predetermines the criteria of number of things. It will determine the criteria of what are you actually looking for, what is eligible in your inclusion of your, eventually what you will include in your review. It would predetermine how you are going to appraise it. What is being considered as quality, not quality, what are the things you are going to look at. It also predetermine how you are going to synthesize it. Although not all of them would predetermine the synthesize method, but many of them would. And the other very typical systematic review feature is that it tends to be, or that's the ideal at least, is to have exhaustive research. So here again, in the traditional literature review, we kind of tend to not cherry picking, but we tend to, we don't know actually why we select that certain, we sometimes have some idea of that is the key publications, but we don't necessarily, have the kind of evidence almost showing that, that is indeed most cited or most co-cited one way or another. And we don't tend to do exhaustive search. Exhaustive here means that you search the published, but we talk about this publication bias, but we also search in other kind of things. We search in the conferences, tend to be kind of less peer reviewed. Sometimes we search the preprint. We sometimes search the dissertations, which tend to be not published. We tend to also search gray literature. We tend to search even kind of some policy analysis, or kind of we really broaden out the search field. And people also would include that depend on your knowledge of the field, that you can reach out to the certain authors, they've been written in that field, but it's not showing up in the database that you draw. You can reach out to them, or you can reach out to the institutions that possibly write about or possibly research on that. And the other thing, let me see whether I have a slide on that. I probably have a slide on how to search. But the other thing about systematic review is that about doing and reporting, sometimes those criteria we talk about, for eligibility and for appraisal, whatever, they are not only they predetermined, but they are also published as part of the reviews. And sometimes these criteria, they are actually peer reviewed. They will be they will be peer reviewed first before actually one actually does a review, does a systematic review. So it's a lot more rigorous. It's a lot more like you can't just change your mind once you see something and you think, okay, it's not enough, or this is not good, or I will change. So you determine a lot of things beforehand. And then for reviews, these are kind of, again, one way of kind of type of the reviews. We tend to say that it's quantitative, it's qualitative, or other kind of synthesis or reviews. Quantitatively, there are generally, these two types are the most well-known types. One is called vote counting, which is that, let's say you have 5 studies, so one count, one vote into your final findings. So you will say that among the 5 studies, let's say 3 of them are positive result, 2 of them are negative result. So there's more positive, this thing is basically more likely to be having a positive effect. And you probably have picked up that because it's vote counting, then there's a bias to it, because some studies, although it's it's negative, maybe it has a much larger sample size, so it should count more. So this is where the meta-analysis comes in, is that it taking into consideration of those kind of features of the study themselves. It will take it, especially about samplings, but also the kind of effect. It would eventually kind of combine all those things together, and then producing almost like a number of the effect size. Again, sometimes the quantitative synthesis or review is not possible, or it's not feasible, or it's just not actually desirable. Then one would do a qualitative synthesis, which you actually would qualitatively describing those studies, qualitatively kind of really trying to see what's happening among the database that you have come up. The best evidence synthesis is interesting. It's been kind of proposed as an alternative to meta-analysis. But actually, if you read its description, it's not exactly opposite of meta-analysis. What it does is that it basically just go out and find the good evidence. So you will have the things to analyze the quality of whatever you collect, the primary studies. But then it depends on how many good primary studies you find. If there are very few, one can determine what is few. But if it's few, then you do a qualitative synthesis. If it's the number is large enough, you do a quantitative, and then you depend on what you can decide to do what kind of quantitative analysis. So in a way, it's almost like a kind of mixed method. So depending on what comes, you decide later on whether you do a quant or qual. And recent years have also seen rapid reviews, which take a much shorter period of time, generally a few months, as opposed to about a year for typical systematic reviews. Rapid reviews, they will have a little bit less kind of rigid or stringent kind of quality appraisal kind of analysis, or to kind of sourcing all the exhaustive and so on and so forth. But that has been done quite a lot, especially in the policy domains. And some of the words can't really see. So again, this is still about systematic reviews. So I just want to give you kind of a brief history, because I mean, it's a very interesting whole story. It actually, interestingly, systematic review is very closely related to meta-analysis. And it actually started about, basically, it's about synthesis, about findings, and it actually started as early as mid-70s, and it's in the field. It started with education and kind of psychology, so, psychotherapy. And then what happened was that then really in the late 70s, it really starting to take off in medicine, especially. And Cochrane, he actually called for the kind of summary or synthesis of the RCTs, and he is the first one who really established a database called Cochrane database, really capture all those summaries or critical appraisal of the RCTs in medicine. And then this also starting to kind of really just publishing the review, starting to sing around in the 80s, and it's starting to move into the kind of certain journals, and there are also journals that are dedicated to reviews, but also sometimes occasionally one will see in the other kind of normal journals. But in the beginning, all the systematic reviews are really being basically belong to one of those systematic review database one way or another. But later on, it's really starting to kind of spread out. And the Cochrane collaboration was formed in the early 90s. They still do a lot of systematic reviews. And also over time, and so far you've seen that it's mostly in medicine. That's really the big trunk of the systematic reviews. And since the mid-90s, we're starting to see systematic reviews and meta-analysis starting into other kind of fields, social, kind of more broadly social science. And we also, in South Africa, it's the similar kind of story. Really, it's, by the 2010, around that time, we're starting to see systematic reviews being kind of commissioned by the presidency. At that time, I was working with the Human Sciences Research Council, and we have some interactions with, and UJ has a center on looking at African evidence network. They actually do quite a lot of systematic reviews. But that's the time that actually South Africa is starting to pick this up. And generally, when people do systematic review, they would invoke some words called PRISMA, which is this acronym for Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analysis. But it's generally, we just call it PRISMA. And generally, when you see PRISMA, you will see this kind of figures. And it's starting from identification. That's how many. The other thing is one generally need to record the numbers very, very well. Like one need to do a very good bookkeeping. Is that once record how many was the one that you find in which database and what kind of keywords you used, and whether you use one database or you have kind of supplementary databases. And if you used hand search or whatever, we will come back to just now, then you also would include, so that's just adding to this, the total record. So if this is the record, then you would do the screening. Screening, you will have certain criteria to, exclude. But this is usually, when you are just looking at the title or, looking at whatever. So you will exclude, let's say, according to language, or you will exclude, let's say the list and the editorials that we mentioned earlier. So you will say that you are excluding certain things, or you exclude certain years. So that's kind of the screening process. And then after the first initial screening, then again you would kind of assess it according to its abstract, because again, this is the phase that sometimes people would say that we are only looking at say empirical studies, and then you would look at abstract, or sometimes people say that we are only looking at the articles or whatever that's using a certain kind of theoretical framework. So that at this stage, then you would include only these ones, and you will exclude others. And again, you need to record all those numbers. And then sometimes it does go to full text, although not everyone does that, but sometimes people do assess the quality of the thing, of the articles or document in its full text. And here is also sometimes people would do the coding in terms of this. Let's say this is empirical study, this is using qualitative, quantitative, or is action research, or is using what, which countries, the study, taking place in which countries, so they do some kind of coding. They might also do some coding related to the qualities, meaning that whether, if it's experiment, are they using the RCTs, or are they using the matching, or are they using quasi, or they are using what? And does it fit into the quality that, one has, the criteria that one has specified earlier? So again, this part of assessing the quality is generally not very rigorously done in the systematic review, but it's actually a very, very important part of that. And after you've done all that, you synthesize the findings. And searching. So searching is very, very important in terms of, what kind of database you have. And especially for, systematic review, you need to search, we have mentioned that you need to search multiple databases. And they are specialist databases. Those include, for example, the other thing is also always good to start searching the reviews. Because again, if there are reviews on your particular field, I mean, that's always a good starting point, because that will save you a lot of effort already. But then, of course, you need to see when that review was done, how comprehensive that review is, the quality of that review. But starting with that, and after that, then you go to the certain databases, and you can search certain databases or the library catalogs, sorry. And then we all use search engines. Again, Google Scholar is actually a very good first stop general search for almost any topics. But the thing is, one can't stop with just using Google Scholar alone, because it does have its kind of limitations one way or another. And one could search conference proceedings. One could search, we mentioned some of that. Where do you search, especially if you want to do a more exhaustive kind of search? You search the database, the dissertation database. You can tap into a network. You could kind of really know, certain relevant networks or associations, or the personal contact. And the other two very typical searching way we do is called backwards and forward citation tracking. So one is that you look at the articles or the documents that you have already identified, and you go to their reference list. And you go through their reference list to see whether they might be there that is relevant to your purpose. And the forward citation tracking, or the forward citation, is that then you basically put that, you find that particular, reference, you put that probably into Google Scholar one way or another to see who is citing that particular document. And then you see that, among all those ones are listed, whether anyone that you want to add further into your database. Those two are very good, actually, way to supplement what you have already have. And so here I list some of the, the databases, especially that already have lots of systematic reviews. And I also kind of listed a bit about their primary domains. So these are specialist database that has lots of systematic reviews already on their database. The Cochrane, I mean, they are one of the first, and they are still one of the biggest. They are primarily focused on health. And again, you will see that many of them are actually primarily focusing on health, because again, that's the field that has been seeing most of the systematic reviews. And if we are more into the broader social science, then Campbell is a good source to go. Epicenter is also good. And then 3IE also has something. What works is an interesting kind of database almost. It also, I remember one of the what works for education is that it even have information of not only the effect size of certain things, but also how much money for that particular interventions, which is actually quite rare in some of the other databases. But it's a very, very important information, especially for policymakers. And some of these databases do have a compilation of program evaluation. So sometimes they would have just broadly evaluation studies, not necessarily systematic reviews, but generally they have lots of systematic reviews. And other kind of bibliographic database, some of them also has quite a few of systematic reviews. The typical database that we know. You can also just go in there and search for systematic reviews. And certain journals, they are reviewed journals. They are also normal journals. Some of them do publish systematic reviews as well. And here is actually something that I mentioned in a way. It's the p-value, or the kind of almost the power, is that one, I think, needs to be mindful that the statistical power is different from effect size. So statistical power is just telling you that whether it's kind of, both of them use the word of significant, but one is just that, whether it's statistically significant. The other one is whether the effect size is actually large enough to almost worthwhile to do that kind of experiment, or to do that kind of interventions. And the other thing is, sometimes this kind of even when we talk about effect size, sometimes it depends on a lot of things, and one of the things is depending on the pooling method. And here I'm showing you, this is the example of if you use a fixed effect model or a random effect model, using the same data, you will see the different result. And the difference between these two models is the assumption. So the assumption of the fixed model is that whether the true effect size of the different studies, they are the same. So that's the assumption of the fixed effect model. And the random effect model assumes that those different studies, their true effect size, they follow a normal distribution. They are not necessarily the same, but they follow a normal distribution. So as you might expect, that random effect is probably more realistic, but their overall, usually we just see this diamond, because that's the overall effect size. Usually the effect size tend to be less precise, and tend to be having a wider kind of range. And you can see even in this example is that actually by using the fixed model or the random model, actually one would be favoring the intervention. The other one actually says that thing really doesn't make a sense, make a difference. So sometimes this kind of model also make a difference in terms of the result. This thing, in a way, I mentioned that when we talk about the homogeneity. So whether it's this is actually something one need to decide, especially for quantitative synthesis, that one need to decide at the beginning of when you're doing that synthesis whether it's actually worthwhile, whether it's suitable. And there are many different sources of heterogeneity. There can be because of the intervention that, different participants, different control groups, different intervention itself, whether they are similar enough, whether the outcome is being captured using similar measurement, whether the evaluation is of similar length, whether it's evaluating at a similar time, because one can evaluate immediately after it stops, or say 2-3 years down the line, which will be very, very different. The heterogeneity can also manifest in the methodological kind of diversity, whether whether the study design, the primary study design, they are different, how different they are, whether they actually include some consideration of the biases, or even where you are searching the studies, where it's about when you are searching, there can be lots of different things that come into the play here. There can be also the statistical heterogeneity. This is about whether the variation of that effect size from the different primary studies, they are larger than what is expected due to chance or error. So there are many sources of these heterogeneities. And one thing that I found in one of my review of actually meta-analysis is that some of those diversities are considered better than the others. Generally, again, statistical ones, there's a test one can test. The other ones you can't test, using that test. So how much is that being considered? And the answer is it tends to be not very well thought of, or at least some aspect of it. And then if you do see a lot of or quite substantive heterogeneity, so what can you do? So there are different things, a few different things one can do. One is to group them into subgroups. In one of the one that I was looking at is about bilingual education. Then what some of the people are doing is they group them into primary, school studies, and the experiment that is done in the secondary studies, secondary schools. So just to see whether there might be a difference between those different groups. Sometimes one can do, but it's actually quite rare meta regression, although it's a very good idea, is that you use the outcome, use it as a dependent variables, and then you do a regression on that. And this is in a way kind of not similar, but it's in a way people sometimes talk about it together with moderator analysis, is that you're kind of trying to see whether those different your outcome and some of your variable you are looking at is actually moderated or mediated from a third variable. Or otherwise, you can do a sensitivity analysis if you see some kind of outliers, or if you are not sure whether inclusion of this study or that study would make a difference in your overall findings. Just to see if you do a sensitivity analysis and you find that actually whether including certain studies or not including them doesn't make a much difference, then your finding will be more robust. And so this is really about we are almost at the end of the discussion, my talking, but I want to kind of ask you to think about what you have worked on, in terms of all those different kinds that we have talked about, and what you plan to work on. Maybe after today you heard of something, you find it interesting, you might want to experiment on that. That would be great. And if you have already worked on some of those things, I mean, again, today my focus is more on the reviews, because that's in a way, I think it's actually a good starting point to start from the review, even when we are doing our studies. But also, I would really strongly encourage you to write reviews, to publish reviews, because one, they are more highly cited. Two is that actually it's, in a way, we are all doing some kind of reviews even in our empirical studies before we do the empirical studies. So why not just to expand a little bit on that and publish on that? So if you have already worked on any of those types, I would like to invite you to talk about any of your success and challenges and lessons, maybe you know, your reflection to it. And I think that's my last slide. Yes. And I see Deborah has just put a link in there for evaluations. Ethel, you have a question or comment?
Not a question, Prof, just a comment. I've just finished doing a systematic literature review, and like you said, it's a very exhaustive process. It covers, like, yeah, it is exhaustive. I was just thinking, like, right now I'm trying to decide on my research methodology. So I was thinking of either doing a meta-analysis or a meta-synthesis, just to see what methodologies others in my field have done. So,
Which field you are in, Ethel?
oh, I'm in sustainability assessments for infrastructure development. Yeah.
The thing is, kind of my first reaction is 2 points. One
Yes.
is that generally systematic review is done by a group because it requires different kind of expertise. Generally there will be a librarian, there will be the people who are more in the qual, there will be the people more in the qual, and they will also, you know, talk with usually who initially wanted to have that kind of system. So generally it's actually a group. Not often it's being done by one person. And if it's done by a small group, generally it's good to have 2 people, especially when one is kind of almost kind of evaluating the quality of, you know, appraising the quality of whatever, you know, the primary studies you have. And generally it's good for the 2 people to do it separately and then come together to see whether their, you know, assessment is similar. That's number one. Number 2 is that actually a systematic review. Which level are you doing your study?
PhD.
Actually, a systematic review could be good enough just on its own for a PhD.
Oh,
you might not need to do anything else. Chat to your supervisors, because if a systematic review is very well done, it's actually more than enough for a PhD.
Okay. I was doing with my supervisor and my co-supervisor, so they were counter-checking the quality of my review along the way. And it's good, and they were doing it independently because one is in SA, the other one is in the UK. So it was a back and forth thing.
That's that's a good practice.
Yeah.
But so, talk to them whether they would let you just to, you know, use the systematic review itself, or they really want you to do something else. Because
no, I think this is
it's a lot of work. Even if you want to do, I mean, you are talking about almost like meta-analysis. Those things also take a lot of effort.
Yes, it is a lot of work because I started doing it in January and I finished it in July, and then we had it. So it's a long process. And before that, I was just
6
working
months
on
is
it
actually short for that. I mean, you guys are doing well in 6 months. If you
Oh, really? Because all that time I was thinking like I'm behind. I should pick up speed.
It depends on what you're comparing. So if you are thinking of the general timeline for a PhD, you are not that fast. But if you are comparing it with the general time needed for a good systematic review, you are quick.
Okay.
Systematic review can take about a year to about 18 months, from what I heard.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So I joined this session because I wanted to learn more about meta-analysis and meta-synthesis. And thank you for that, because you've given me a point to start, what I should be looking for, what I should expect, and all that. So thank you for the presentation.
I'm glad that you found something useful. It's still a little bit general, but I think for me it's more like an introduction to it.
Yeah, thank you for the intro then.
Okay. Daniela, I saw your hand was up.
No, I lowered it again. But on the topic, sorry, my printer is calibrating in the background and I can't stop it. It does that from time to time, so I'm not sure if you can hear the noise. So on the advice you gave, Ethel, on doing it as a sole methodology for your PhD, your supervisors will also discuss this for you. One of the important aspects of a PhD is what makes it different to a master's is a unique contribution to the body of knowledge. So if you do decide to use systematic review as a sole methodology, you will have to have a methodological objective, but your supervisors probably would be able to explain that to you. So just it's the point to consider when writing up.
Or like I mean, that's a very good suggestion. I think Ethel, you can take back to your supervisors. But also, it's what is your finding from the systematic reviews? Because from the finding itself, or I'm kind of even imagining if you would be able to propose some kind of, say, a model or a framework or whatever, then that can be also some kind of unique contributions to it. I mean, but Daniel's point is very, very, I mean, eventually you need to kind of think about what is, the contribution that you are making. What's the new knowledge you are making from your PhD? That's the bottom line. But then again, I mean, that's also almost like the bottom line of publication. So, but a systematic review is published, I mean, left and right. I've seen that. So.
I have another question, maybe. I find that it would be more common to use systematic review in certain disciplines, because in my discipline, I have come across very few. It's not a method that's often used in my discipline, to be honest with you. So it would be interesting to see how many are done in your discipline, Ethel. And if it's something that's not frequently done in your discipline, that in itself would be quite a methodological contribution to the theory of methodology. In my field, for instance, it's really, I've come across far and few between, and then it would be a unique contribution in my field.
I think this, what I've seen in education is that there's also kind of shifts, I think, and they also sometimes depend on the, like, where it is, because in the States, like majority of the educational studies are like quantitative single studies, at least from the postgraduate kind of point of view. And then in South Africa, primarily it's small scaled qualitative studies. And then the reviews, I think it's coming up, but then again, usually so far I haven't seen students really doing like very kind of focused or doing that, or very deliberately kind of doing that. But I mean, I agree with you that it could depend on the field. But I found what's interesting about reviews is that you can do review in almost all fields. I think maybe the review I haven't really been seeing much, again, in my exposure to the various fields, is that I haven't seen much of the reviews in the philosophy papers that I've read. Maybe I want to do one in one of the days. That could be interesting. I mean, eventually, I think a review is something, it's kind of, you can do it in any field almost. But what you said is that whether those kind of things are prominent, or whether you see a lot of that in that field, is an interesting observation and a question.
Yeah, there's been very little in our field, but our field mostly focuses on policy analysis. But it's not to say that it's not an important or useful method to use, not at all. I had a colleague whose student did her master's on case study writing in our particular field. So if you really want to specialize in methodology and you want to do a thesis on that, it's also another point to consider, but I don't think that's the focus of Ethel's PhD.
No, maybe Daniel, you should, one of the days, you should give a workshop on the methodology in your field. Okay? You can talk to Tebo.
Thank you. It was a nice workshop. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Glad. I also see the comment from Pretorius talking about maybe taking some step back to look at the search strategy. Search is a very, very important in almost anything. I think, I mean, obviously important in research, but even in other aspects of our lives. but I mean, it's almost like garbage in, garbage out. And what kind of search strategy you use and where you search, it actually has a very, very big impact on what eventually one would come out. And that's why, in a way, I've been starting to, I think from the beginning of this year, encouraging my students really always do a bibliometric review, a quick one, even if they don't use it in their dissertation, kind of really having a map out of what's happening. And sometimes it's like interesting finding something from those kind of reviews, because it kind of tells you, not only sometimes we identify, journals speaking specifically to that topic, like otherwise we wouldn't have noticed. Or, the authors we generally know, but which paper are we talking about and why that paper is particularly influential and who's actually citing those papers. And some of the bibliometric review, actually, they take even a step further. They will analyze how people are citing, because I mean, citing is one thing, it's just a number, but one can citing agreeing with it, one can cite disagreeing with it, and there are different ways of citing, and some of the I've seen those bibliometric reviews, they actually go even further than that. It's very, very interesting actually to really see how the field is like, how it's happening in the field. And I think the other kind of the thing that I found really useful is really to identify the clusters in the field, to like why there are those different colors, why there are those different groups, what exactly are they doing that's slightly different, from the other groups. That, we call it the intellectual structure, which is a very interesting, even actually sometimes, because people generally don't always aware of that. Some of those science mapping papers are really, that's one of the big contributions from them, from talking about those kind of intellectual structures. But I really hope, I mean, you guys learn something. I mean, it's quite almost like introduction and entry level. I mean, we didn't really get into doing things, but yeah, maybe you learn something that you didn't know about before, something. It seems like I'm moderating. Pretorius, you're asking about bibliometric review. So they need to go with, one is database, the other is the kind of almost, we call it visualization tool. So the database, again, depending on your field. If it's social science, Scopus is a good starting point. If it's more natural science, VOS is a good starting point. The problem with Google Scholar is that you can't export that database and use it in the other education, also Scopus generally. You can't export it to the other kind of softwares. And the visualization, Force Viewer is a good starting point. It's generally quite intuitive. It's generally, the graph looks good. It's not so hard to use, and one can write to those people. At some point, like I was having some issues, and I write to the people who developed that system, and they answer very quickly. It's not as powerful as a few others that I know of, but those ones I haven't really experimented on them, so I don't know. I've seen how they can create the different kind of graphs, which is actually very, very impressive. And at some point, I will probably experiment on that. But Voice Viewer is a very good starting point. And again, if you are, especially you are in education, I mean, you can reach out to me. We can look at. I'm not sure what exactly is a topic, but one can be looking at it together. I mean, one day or another. I'm more than happy to do that together with you. And the other thing I think I will also say on that point is that, I mean, you can, I think you guys are probably all registered on the postgraduate thing. So Hellinger, Prof. Hellinger has done, and over the years, he actually been, doing that for the postgraduate schools. He's been talking about, doing science mapping, doing the Scopus and Force Viewer, and he's been published like crazy on the various topics within education using that tool. So, and I believe those sessions are recorded. It's probably on the postgraduate school website somewhere in that organization. Yeah, Teboho?
Yes, that is correct. Prof. Hellinger's workshops
Yeah.
are available on our Blackboard
Yeah.
community. The resources are available on the Blackboard community.
He been giving quite a few workshops on that over the years.
Prof, can you, sorry, I'm hearing myself. Can you please type the spelling of his name in the chat box?
Okay, I will quickly, just to make sure that I don't. Teboho, otherwise, would you be able to spell it? I mean, he's very well known. Okay, I found it. In the education field. Okay, I just typed it there. So just Google him. Connected Paper is another database that I've heard not too long ago. It's in a way, it's kind of basically, that's my understanding of it, is that it will show you other similar papers to that, but it's technically not a database that we kind of use for our purpose, for that kind of review kind of purposes. Probably need to search a bit about that. I heard about it, yeah, some time ago. I didn't really check too much about that. And I think people also talk about that as another database that's coming up. But the thing is, you know, if one wants to do science mapping, one need to make sure that the format that when, you know, the database one draw from, you know, whatever database needs to be acceptable in the other software, which is currently VOSviewer. And VOSviewer, they are, you know, certain format it's accept and not like everything. That is why, like the Google Scholar, I mean, firstly, I don't know whether Google Scholar you can draw a database like search result. And secondly, VOSviewer definitely doesn't recognize that that kind of format. So it's just a lot of more effort trying to make the two systems talk to one another. Teboho, am I facilitating myself? I kind of just take over because, like, when I run a class, that's what I do. I watch the chat and so that's fine.
It's perfectly fine. I don't have a problem with it.
Otherwise, if there are no other questions, maybe we can call it a day.
Yes.
I see the time is already. But otherwise, I mean, you can reach out to me. I'm just putting my email address. I mean, if you want to ask anything further or whatever, yeah, I mean, we can always chat after this.
No, but thank you, Prof, for the wonderful workshop, and thank you to the participants who have been so engaged and interactive throughout the whole session. And I would assume that you know, they've gotten whatever nuggets that they need to continue with their research. And thank you once again for availing yourself. Yeah, he didn't take over. It's absolutely fine.
Okay, so yeah.
Yeah, I think then I'll stop the recording now. But yes, thank you everyone, and thank you, Prof. Yuki.
Okay, so you guys keep well, and yeah, if anything, like I said, just get into touch. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye. Thank
Thanks
you.
so much for a great workshop. Bye bye.
Bye.